speakers, which I'd like to introduce to you now. Firstly, Cecilie Thorsmark, the former communication director of the Global Fashion Agenda. Cecilie today is the CEO of the Copenhagen Fashion Week. As CEO, she established the Sustainability Advisory Board of industry professionals and welcomed on board in Futurium to help shape the sustainable development of the Copenhagen Fashion Week. I'm also joined by Clare Press, who is the founder of The Wardrobe Crisis. She's a Sydney-based journalist, filmmaker, author, and presenter, not just of The Wardrobe Crisis, but also of the Ethical Fashion podcast, which she co-produces and hosts together with UN officer Simone Cipriani. Clare was also the first ever Vogue sustainability editor, and formerly with the Ellen Arthur MacArthur Foundation initiative. She has really pioneered the idea of sustainability in fashion, and also important to point out for this panel is that she is part of the Copenhagen Fashion Week Sustainability Advisory Board. So very excited to be joined by the two of you for this discussion. I would like to begin by giving you the opportunity to share a little bit of the work that you do. And I'd like to start with you, Cecilie. How are you going about this endeavor of turning something like the Copenhagen Fashion Week into also a flagship for sustainability? Maybe you can walk us through your current thoughts and work and everything that you've achieved so far too.
Yep, and thank you for the introduction, Geraldine. And you're completely right. I joined as the CEO of Copenhagen Fashion Week about almost 3 years ago, actually. And the reason why I joined Copenhagen Fashion Week, or the reason why I decided to apply for this position, as you said, coming from the Global Fashion Agenda, which is an advocacy forum for sustainability in the fashion industry, why the heck would someone then go, onto heading of a fashion week, which is probably the opposite, or what we know as the opposite to a sustainability advocacy forum. I did it because I saw the potential to innovate a fashion week, Copenhagen Fashion Week in specific, but also to challenge the format of fashion weeks in general. So the first thing I did was, as you're mentioning, I decided to establish a sustainability advisory board comprising both industry representatives from our local community in Copenhagen, brand representatives mostly, but also the Global Fashion Agenda, former CEO, our mayor of culture in Copenhagen, but I also invited some international profiles whom I really admire, such as Clare Press and also Amy Powney of Mother of Pearl. So that was the first step, because I had some very, I would say, radical thoughts, and I can go into them afterwards. I had some very radical thoughts on how to change Fashion Week, but wanted to make sure that I was completely aligned with the industry around me, both locally, but also hearing some fashion and sustainability experts from abroad to hear if it resonated. To me, what I ultimately wanted was to reflect a little bit more on what's going on in society and in politics around us. I found fashion weeks in general to be a little too maybe tone deaf is the wrong, or is a very harsh word, but a little too ignorant of some of the big issues that actually concern our fashion industry. So first step, the Sustainability Advisory Board, and maybe a good way to introduce Clare further.
Yes, absolutely. Clare, yes, I would love to hear from you what that experience has been like, especially looking at, as Cecilie said, the Fashion Week not being sort of the primary thing that you'd look at as a flagship for sustainability.
Thank you. Thank you for those very kind words. Well, my background is in journalism, and I worked in magazines for many years. I no longer do that, but as part of that role, I held roles at Vogue and at Marie Claire in conventional fashion, shall we say, so not in sustainability. And I used to flit around the world to all the fashion weeks from where I live. I'm a Brit, but I live in Sydney. So I travel from Sydney to Milan, to London, all the time, and think that was absolutely normal. So look, the previous ways in which fashion weeks operate, and I say that with I have to be a bit careful about my words because I think we are racing back to potentially a new normal now. But the previous way that fashion weeks and indeed the industry were set up, sustainability wasn't part of that conversation. And so for me, as someone who now focuses purely on sustainability, and as you mentioned, I was the first Vogue sustainability editor, but now I work on my own platforms in podcasting and I write books. But for me, in that area, to be asked to come and to be part of an advisory council and board and talk about ways that we can use the power of these events to advance sustainability in a really serious way, pushing goals forwards, not just talking, but looking at setting goals around carbon reduction, reducing plastic waste, all of those things. I thought that was extremely exciting. I think in this conversation where we're talking about the role that cities can play, there's something very cool about the less obvious, shall we say, fashion cities pushing this agenda first, because I think it's more difficult for the very established fashion cities, talking about Paris, I'm talking about New York, to push this agenda, and they are coming forward now and doing more work in this space, which is great. But yeah, I think that there's an amazing role for pioneering sustainability-minded cities to kind of get between their teeth and get on with it. So yeah, I was really excited to be part of it. And I would just say that it's also happening here in Sydney where I live, that there is more of a movement towards taking sustainability seriously when it comes to fashion events.
Thank you so much for that, Claire. Is that an opportunity that you saw, Cecile? This idea that giving the Copenhagen Fashion Week this extra edge or something that would make it perhaps a bit different and unique in regard to other fashion weeks as well. So something that would be even desirable as a unique marketing aspect. Was also a little bit of your thinking when you decided to focus in more on sustainability?
That was not my primary purpose of doing it, but for sure it does set us apart from other fashion weeks, or it did set us apart from other fashion weeks. Hopefully we'll be seeing a movement towards the same target of all reinventing the way that or our role as a fashion week. But my primary purpose for doing this was actually a very firm belief that we could drive change, because a fashion week is a huge platform and it's a very important platform for most brands in the industry, whether they do shows, they do it maybe primarily for the press coverage and the visuals, or whether they're at trade fairs for the sales, or in showrooms for the sales. It's such an important platform. And
absolutely, and I was
saying that. Yeah, no, I just wanted to finish because it goes without saying that if you have a big platform, then you should use it wisely. So I wanted to explore how we could use that big voice that we have twice a year, but also in between seasons, to take responsibility and to use our platform in a different way than what's normally to be expected of fashion weeks. Because what we ultimately did was say, well, to begin with, I was like, can we change how the companies are working? I had my back and forths with myself and the advisory board thinking, there's maybe a limit to how much we can actually, impose on the fashion companies. But then it doesn't take a lot of imagination to come up with, well, actually, we can change because we are a big platform. We have power. And once you have power, you can make new measures, new rules that in this case, our brands must adhere to. So that was our ultimate approach, that we thought, let's introduce minimum standards that are not only minimum standards relating to the show that they put on during Copenhagen Fashion Week, but minimum standards that relate to all aspects covering the entire value chain. So if we could do that, then we can actually drive change out there in the industry. And that's a new role for Fashion Week.
Absolutely. And so sorry, I obviously didn't mean to cut into what you were saying. So thank you very much for explaining that, because I think that is such an important thing to point out. Some of these events that we host have a much larger role in the cities that we live in beyond those few days that we actually host the show. But they try to set the tone for an industry or for a scene or for a community, all of those for the entire year, of course. And I think you explained that very well, how you're doing that at Fashion Week. My question earlier was, of course, just alluding to the fact that it's somehow also something very exciting if we've come so far, that sustainability or circularity or these other concepts being brought forth are already they're no longer in the niche, but they're already things that we can actually use to brand and market forward-looking events such as yours. And I think that's something that's probably could also be true for the city of Berlin. Claire, you had also sort of dropped in the new normal when you were speaking earlier. And I was wondering if you can elaborate a little bit how you were seeing this very special time that we're living in, also in regard to, well, what Cecilie was speaking about the sort of the agency that we have through the things that we do, and perhaps those even being increased in some ways, the potential for raising our voice with these new means that we have has been increased. At the same time, of course, things have changed so dramatically throughout the pandemic. Our horizons perhaps have become a little bit smaller through not being able to travel and not being able to move. How do you think that is impacting things at the present?
There's so much tension, isn't there, between the sort of rush to, and absolutely understandably want to get back to normal, in inverted commas, and the sort of, I think, perhaps many of us feel this way, deeply felt knowledge that we shouldn't. The planet doesn't want us to get back to normal as it used to be. I'm not an expert on the entire world, but if you just want to look purely at fashion, our normal was not sustainable and still is not sustainable. Have you ever seen the stats on what we're projected to grow by 2030 if we carry on as business as usual? And these stats come from the Pulse of Fashion report, which is actually Global Fashion Agenda, another Danish organisation that Cecilie just mentioned. But 81%, that's what we're projected to grow. So for all of these far-reaching sustainability goals that these companies are getting excited about and telling everyone about, we're still growing exponentially. We're still producing far too much. The last figures we have are more than 150 billion garments a year, and we're dispatching a crazy amount of those to landfill. So if you add that into our kind of hyper-consumerist culture, which is deeply embedded in many of our countries, I don't think that we are changing as quickly as we need to. So I don't know. Look, the pandemic has been a serious... It's caused serious pain to many in the fashion supply chain. Let's remember that. If you want to look at garment workers, for example, it's been catastrophic for garment workers who've been impacted by cancelled orders. And also for, I don't know, imagine you're working in retail, you've lost your job. It's kind of across the board that the pandemic has shaken the industry. And I have huge empathy for that. But there's also this tension where we know we need to change. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is that hurtling back to normal or trying to do that, I don't think we should be doing that. I think we should be a little bit braver and to embrace the change, to be the architects of what a changed industry will look like post-pandemic. And it's very hard work, and I don't have this, but I think that that's the work that we have to do. That our challenge now is to try to shape a fashion industry that is more responsible to people and planet, and to do so in a way that builds greater resilience for it if future pandemics or if climate shocks hit our industry and our global community. And I think that's the work. So I don't know if that answered your question, but these are things that I'm constantly thinking about now as I sit in my wardrobe that I've been working out of for 16 months.
Yeah. Do you see that taking impact on the discussions that you're having, Cecilie, with the different actors that come into play? How do you feel that, that the situation the world is currently caught in is impacting, also particularly in regard to issues like local production and connections between supply chains? How are you seeing that?
I definitely agree with Claire, first of all, that there is this, tendency to say we don't want to go back to normal. We shouldn't go back to normal. But I think things are slowly changing. We are, however, also seeing some important shifts which could hopefully disrupt the industry, such as, for example, resale, which has increased a lot. I think we all, during our lockdowns, looked into our wardrobes and thought, okay, maybe this is a chance to thrift a little bit more. And I read a report. It was the ThredUp report saying that I think it was 33 million people, or that 2020 gave 33 million new consumers of thrifting, which I think alone is a lot, just happening in 1 year. And I think the growth projection of resale is, I think it's projected to double in just 5 years from now. So that's I think that's a tendency or a trend that we should embrace, and that no longer just lives, in the consumer or the citizen sphere, but is something that the companies are also taking in. We are seeing a lot of, for example, white label solutions being offered to brands for the easy and accessible adoption of resale. Why should let's say a Ghani item only be thrifted through external re-commerce platforms? Why not in their own sphere? So it's a new business model, which I think, and as I said, I hope can disrupt the industry, because it is an attractive business model for the companies, and it's obviously the most sustainable way of shopping as well. I think that answered maybe a part of your question.
It's a very nice example, and you're right. So many brands are catching on to this movement, let's say, and this development, and also it kind of gives an opportunity to build new relationships between brands and customers, in a sense. Claire, what other aspects do you see as being maybe disrupted also in a positive way when it comes to local and global supply chains, and also their interplay?
Right. I mean, I mentioned before the negative, that disruptions from the pandemic and cancelled orders had dreadful impacts on garment workers, particularly in countries like Bangladesh or Myanmar or Cambodia. But on the back of that, we've also seen, I think, right, a conversation towards reshoring. Should we reshore more of our production? It's a very attractive prospect, right, to have a shorter supply chain with less opacity, where we can presumably respond more quickly and maybe be more flexible when it comes to customer demand. I think it's such an interesting thing. I'm hearing it all around the world, here where I am in Australia. And if you're in Berlin, obviously, you may be thinking, Australia is so far away, what's that got to do with me? But I think it's quite interesting that in this conversation about global fashion, we've been so connected. It didn't matter where you were. We can click our fingers and something turns up from the other side of the world. Who knows where it's traveled in order to get to us, and we can impatiently expect that it will turn up in the next 2 days. I think actually we're in the middle of a huge change where the things we've taken for granted are going to change, have already changed drastically, but are going to continue to change. And I think the expectation that we can have everything now from any place is going to be hollow. I think the idea of reshoring is going to gain momentum. More of us are going to be asking if we can try to make things more close to home. But I also think that comes with a caveat, which is, I mean, how many years have we worked on this global supply chain? 30? It's just not simple to roll it back. I did pull out a report that the EU published this year called Post-COVID-19 Value Chains Option Reshoring Production Back to Europe in a Globalized Economy. That is a long title. And it looked at these influencing factors, which were like, yes, we want to do it because it decreases vulnerability. There's all these trade wars happening, so greater rivalry and digital transformation. So there's all these reasons. And yet the report was like, okay, let's try, but it's not going to happen tomorrow. Fashion wasn't central to it, but I think we ought to be realistic. We're not going to be able to reshore our production wherever we are in Europe. Well, look, I suppose that in Italy and Portugal, it's going to be easier to bring more production home. But I think there are many countries where it's been decades since we've had robust textile industries, and reshoring's just not practically likely. So I think what we're seeing is more demand for that, but it's going to be very slow. And we're going to be stuck with this global supply chain that we've built over decades. And the job now is to try to make it more transparent and more responsible, I think.
Absolutely. And I guess, you know, depending on which field you're coming in from, it's also kind of debatable how much reshoring is desirable. Like if you're looking at it from a development corporation perspective, you might be seeing the economic interests of countries that are production sites today.
Absolutely.
So maybe it's also about the question, how do we link the local with the global? How do we create better transparent structures? How do we create better forms of cooperation where there's local communities supporting global, sustainable global supply chains and everything that needs to be part of that framework? Sorry, Claire, did you want to jump back in there?
Oh, just to say that also the other side of that is how grossly irresponsible and terrible it would be to turn off the tap tomorrow and to say, well, reshoring's the answer and never mind about all of the people who make our clothes. And let's remember that the people who make our clothes are primarily women and primarily in the global south. So,
yeah. Cecile, that connection between... Absolutely. Sorry, Claire. That connection between the local and the global, and seeing how we can create better cooperation between the two. How is that something that you're also trying to give space to at Copenhagen Fashion Week, or try to sort of feature these ideas?
I think our journey, or how everything has evolved at Copenhagen Fashion Week, is a very good example of how we went from, of course, being super dependent on our local ecosystem within the Danish fashion industry, because when we announced that we would transform our fashion week to this degree, it was obviously super important to have the support from our local fashion brands, from the local industry organizations, from local academia, from the global fashion agenda around the corner, from, you know, from this very local ecosystem. And what we did was to first of all, you know, announce that this would go into effect, and it would be something that the Danish, or, well, we have more than just Danish, but we have Scandinavian and Nordic, some German, some UK brands also participating at our fashion week, but this would be something for them to adhere to. But what we're doing now is trying to actually scale it and export it to other countries, because the potential of our framework of demanding minimum standards from brands is, as you mentioned earlier, it's good for the marketing of Copenhagen Fashion Week probably, but that's not going to have a big impact globally. So if we can export this framework to other countries, to other fashion weeks and other organizations, then that's where I can start maybe ticking off a box that, yes, you know, we did succeed with our mission. And so we were happy to announce just a month ago during Copenhagen Fashion Week our first non-Danish partner, which is the Norwegian fashion industry, headed by the Norwegian Fashion Hub, which is an industry association, and the Oslo Fusion Festival, which is an arts and fashion festival taking place. So they're the first ones to say, hey, we're going to implement these minimum requirements as well. And we have several other hopefully very fruitful dialogues, but dialogues that are quite progressed with, I would say, another 7-8 organizations within the Nordics, but also in other European countries. So I'm hoping that it will foster a more, global movement, being able to hopefully scale it to be implemented in other countries.
That's fantastic
It's
news.
really...
Thank you so much for sharing that, Cecile. Sorry, Claire, I was just going to say, do a shout out to any audience members listening, thinking I want my event to adhere to these standards and to be on the same level as Cecile's, then please get in touch. Sorry, Claire, please.
Oh, no, I was just going to say that I think it's while we talk of doom and gloom and, how we're going to get through the pandemic as the architects of a new future when it's so difficult, I find this really inspiring because there's so much dialogue happening and there's so much collaboration between different cities when it comes to how we might draw that new future. I think it's terrific. It does feel like a good time to be wanting to make change because there's so many people out there that you can work together. And I feel like when I started this work a few years back, it didn't feel that way. There wasn't that kind of momentum for change. You felt like you were on the outside shouting and no one was listening.
Yeah.
The gang has grown and so has the momentum. I would like to just circle back to the beginning of our conversation where you outlined, Cecile, how you basically started with a network by building a network of people that you knew you wanted to have at the table to share their ideas. And going on from there, I wanted to see how important do you think this idea of community building, especially at the current times, is at the local level between different kinds of stakeholders, especially as we are a bit more homebound these days. And is that something, because you outlined earlier how Copenhagen Fashion Week was also maybe doing this not just for the event itself, but beyond the stretch of the event?
Yeah, but I think actually parallel to maybe the trends that we're seeing around the globe, where the local community building is becoming reinforced in many places. I think what Copenhagen Fashion Week is experiencing these days is actually developing into a much more global player, which is why, of course, our local community building will always remain, super important and crucial, because without the industry here in Denmark, we would be nothing. But with these very high ambitions that also cover a more rolling it out on a broader industry level and globally, we very much depend on our global community building. And which is why we've also, for example, going back and circling back to what I initially said about the Sustainability Advisory Board, we actually just restructured it and brought in new members to reflect where we are at in our journey. So we're, in the beginning of our journey, if you could say phase one of this of our journey, it was important to have local brands represented in our Sustainability Advisory Board. Now we've included global experts from different fields, covering everything from human rights to materials experts. Clare Press is luckily still in our Sustainability Advisory Board, but we very much depend on getting access and to all of the knowledge that's out there globally, international standards and legislation and trends in general. And that's why I think our global community building is in this phase two of the rollout of our strategy.
Thank you so much for explaining how that is working for Copenhagen Fashion Week. And I think that's such an important point you made. Like, as you're becoming a global player, knowing what's happening on the local level is of equal importance, and bridging that is part of the job that you do. We have all these tools and technologies to sort of make the world a bit smaller, and in some ways also, I think, a responsibility to see, especially as if you're a large organization or globally operating organization, the very local impacts that you're having. Is that something, Claire, in your work, where you see, how can we sort of make these connections between the grassroots and the global a bit stronger? What possibilities do we have to do that?
I think it's actually happening whether or not we set it in motion from, big organizations or from industry. What we're seeing now is that social media has completely, it sounds obvious to say it, but it's just the case. Social media, direct consumer, and the democratization of access to fashion information has just blown the whole thing up. So actually, I think we're already seeing really beautiful flourishing of smaller designers, new generation, incredible fashion graduates who are all focused on upcycling and sustainability, who've got a completely different attitude to how they want to see the industry move forward. And I think that what's exciting for me is that grassroots creativity that you used to have to really seek out you used to have to be intrepid to go out there and look for it in places where it was off the beaten track. It's now being brought into our organizations and allowing them to become something new. And I think that's something to get excited about. If you look at fashion weeks, it used to be like, okay, you go to London, maybe there you will find these creative talents. But now you go to Berlin, you go to Copenhagen, you go all over, and you can find this amazing new generation. So I think the grassroots is already broken through, and the old hierarchical top down is fading out. And that's what we're moving towards. And I do feel quite hopeful about it. I think sustainability is deeply embedded in this new generation's thinking. And that also the other side is that, this is a big business. This is not just creative fun, but business is now starting to recognize the value of new thinking and disruptive business models, as Cecilie was saying. And I think that it's almost a moot point to say, how can we bring this stuff in? Because it's already there. I think our job is, how can we support it in order to allow it to flourish and grow and become more of a kind of networked whole. I like the idea of rippling out rather than top down. So I think, I don't know if that answered your question, but I do think, just in summary, that cities have got such a huge role to play in this, that I read this phrase the other day in The Economist, and it was globalization. How do you say it? I'm not sure, but it was a kind of mashup of
localization.
Globalization. And I think, isn't that a lovely idea? Like, we're up for something new now, and what that is, it's up to us to design. But I think that all we know for sure is that what went before is not here anymore. And if you work in a creative industry, or you're in fashion, or you're in events, then how brilliant. Like, that's what we can now use as our clay to mold this new thing. And I think it's cool.
I think that's a wonderful statement, such a hopeful and forward-looking vision sort of to end on. So I want to thank two of you for sharing insights onto the topic of fashion culture from the local to the global level, and also how you're impacting with your work. Exactly this movement that you were just describing. And it was a pleasure to talk to both of you. Thank you, Claire, and thank you, Cecile.